All right. Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to CaTS by GSC. Today we have Renée Hložek with us. She is an associate professor at the Dunlap Institute and the David A. Dunlap Department for Astronomy and Astrophysics. She studies the universe from the earliest moments to the far future. Her work uses statistical methods and precise observations to answer cosmic questions. She makes measurements of both visible and microwave light with telescopes high in the deserts of northern Chile and uses these measurements to learn about the fundamental building blocks of nature. So she is part of a group of scientists who will use the ambitious new Vera C. Rubin telescope to measure the signals from many thousands of supernovae in order to learn about the enigmatic dark energy driving the acceleration of the universe. She leads the dark energy science collaboration within Rubin and develops new statistical techniques to use the telescope data wisely in the hunt to understand this dark energy. This signals encode and the eventual fate of the universe, and she is also interested in measuring the fluctuation in the microwave light from the Big Bang to unravel the secret of the dark matter that binds the universe together. She develops theoretical models and a type of a dark matter that clumps and grows over cosmic time in a very particular way. She, along with colleagues in the Simons Observatory collaboration, are building a series of telescopes in the Atacama Desert to detect minute ripples in the temperature and polarization signals of the nascent light of the universe, which she will discuss in more detail today. So thank you so much, Renée, to come to CaTS and give your talk. We really appreciate it. So go ahead, share your screen, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really great. I really appreciate the invitation. Let me see if I can move myself. Fantastic. Yeah, it's really a privilege to be able to talk to you. I have this animation. Ooh. When you have amazing students, you have amazing logos. But one of the great things about working in large collaborations is that we do get to work with people all around the world, all over Canada, to do this ambitious work. And so I ambitiously am going to tell you a little bit about all of the cosmology we can do with the Simons Observatory. And I'm lucky that my colleague Adam Hinks last week gave you a little bit of an intro into some of the physics of the CMB, but then also into some of the detector technologies and telescope technologies that we use to make these measurements. So this is a slide made by my colleague Colin Hill that shows us, the picture that you've seen, the history of the universe, all the things in it, and in fact, the observations that we can make at different cosmic epochs from the left, which is just after the Big Bang, to the right, which is the universe today, and different time periods and measurements of objects and light from different time periods gives us different snapshots or windows into the universe. And of course, my goal and those of many that I work with is to understand this whole picture. And so as many snapshots as we can help us try and unravel the physics of this time. And so the furthest light that we can see, the light from the last scattering surface or the cosmic microwave background, gives us some picture, first of all, because it tells us about these early moments, but then also how the light changes as a function of time because of the stuff in the universe can also give us insight into those materials as well. So when we talk about the CMB, we talk about observables. So, we measure light, and in fact, we're really measuring the distribution of the light on the sky. This is an old animation now, but one of my favorites made from the WMAP mission from NASA, which just helps us remind ourselves of what we're going to do, because we're going to see a lot of math and power spectra, and we need to put ourselves in context. So if we imagine taking the longitude and latitude, a model of the Earth, right, projecting it into the sky to right ascension and declination, and in this case, we're actually centering on our own galaxy, we get the typical maps that you see of the CMB, and then as we change the light that we're sensitive to from the optical to the infrared and the microwave, and then increase the contrast, so remove the average, we start to see these tiny fluctuations, these hot and cold spots that are telling us something both of the physics of our galaxy. You can see quite clearly there's this big red stripe that's coming from emission in the microwave from our own galaxy, but then those hot and cold spots, and in fact, the kind of distributions of them, how many hot spots of a certain size are there, how many cold spots, etc. tells us something about that physics at the end in the universe. Another way to think about this is in a two sort of statistical average. So in this case, we've gone from a two-dimensional map to a one-dimensional summary statistic, which we call the power spectrum. And you can relate the two together in another cool animation made by us, the ESA space mission, which shows you that where you are on the x-axis of your power spectrum tells you the size of the spot, and the amplitude of the peak tells you the sort of how many or the amplitude of the variance on up and down from zero. So if we have a high amplitude, as you see for some of the earlier peaks, you see that there are lots of fluctuations up and down relative to the zero. Whereas as we get to the smaller amplitude, the fluctuations are small in amplitude. And all of that together, of course, this is a map that we've filtered out so that you're only sensitive to angular scales of a certain size, but really what we get is the whole thing all combined. And that's the power spectrum that you see. So whenever you see these wiggles, it's really telling us that the majority of the amplitude that we see in the fluctuations is coming from scales of a certain size. In this case, it's about a degree. And then we have the pattern of fluctuation is very important because it tells us something about our models of the universe. Okay. The name of the game is, depending on what physics you care about, whether you care about large scale changes that are coming from inflation or small scale changes that are coming from neutrinos or dark matter, you will build an experiment to study the map, to study the sky and make a map that is sensitive to those particular angular sizes. So here is a compilation of a bunch of different telescopes and their data over the last decades. And you see here that some experiments focus mainly on larger scales. So the Planck mission, which was looking from space, and so it could have access to all of these very large scales, these very small values of L on this size. They focused on that, whereas some of the ground-based experiments, like the Atacama Cosmology Telescope that I started working on during my PhD, and the South Pole Telescope, those are actually measuring the fluctuations all the way to smaller scales. And that tells us something about other kinds of physics, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so in addition to this primordial signal that is coming from the early universe, sometimes people will talk about secondary anisotropes. And so they talk about primary anisotropes and secondary anisotropes. It's a bit of a confusing set of terms, but the thing you really need to remember is that the secondary anisotropes, when we make a map of the sky, we are measuring all of the microwave light. And in fact, we're measuring the temperature and the polarization of this microwave light and relative to some average value. And so the change in the temperature, say, relative to a base temperature. And we don't get to pick what the light comes from. So we see light from the CMB, we see light from galaxies, we see light from our own galaxy. And so we characterize the light that's coming from the actual lost scattering surface as the primary, and all the other stuff as the secondary. But those are very important and encode a lot of physics too. So some of them, for example, some of the secondary anisotropes are the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. It's a very fun phrase to say, especially fast at the end of the day, Sunyaev-Zeldovich, and it's named after two Russian scientists that came up with the theory behind these models. So the CMB photon is traveling to us from billions of years ago, and it encounters a galaxy cluster, so many galaxies all together, and in between the galaxies in that cluster, there's hot electron gas, the intercluster medium in these galaxies. And this gas is energetic because it's hot electrons. And so the CMB photons get an energy boost or a kick from these highly energetic electrons, which means that the frequency of the CMB gets boosted from its rest frequency to higher frequencies. So what that means is if I was to plot the frequency of radiation in the direction of that cluster, I would see photons being pushed to higher frequencies. And so what that means is that relative to some base frequency, there are fewer photons at low frequencies, and there are more photons at high frequencies. So that means I've taken CMB light, which is frequency independent. It's just the Planck black body spectrum. And I've introduced a frequency dependence in the region of a cluster of galaxies. Now, this is really cool because it means that we can use, if we can measure the CMB light in the microwave light in different frequencies, the CMB is the same in all of those frequencies. And so the difference that we see from one frequency to another tells us that there's a galaxy cluster there. And so microwave experiments have actually detected a lot of amazingly beautiful and large clusters of galaxies through this signature effect they're imparting in the light. That's what we call the thermal Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect, because it's due to the thermal energy of these electrons. However, imagine if the electrons were moving. You could get this in two ways. Either you could have the actual galaxy clusters are moving, which we know galaxy clusters and pairs of galaxies are often moving towards one another in their own gravitational potential. Or you could have the electrons moving for some other reason, like this is early in the universe and the electrons are being reionized, or the universe is being reionized. If those electrons are moving, they give the photons an extra kick, and we call that the kinetic Zeldovich effect. And so there are these two effects that we can measure by making multi-frequency maps of the microwave sky and by doing statistics to pull out the signal that we expect from galaxies and clusters. And so in this same plot I showed before, you see these yellow and green lines are showing you the thermal SZ effect. You don't have to worry about the difference between them right now. There's an extra change you get because of the relativistic corrections. But then the dashed blue and red lines are the kinetic Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. And you'll see there are very, very subtle effects, very, very subtle changes to the frequency. And so we need to make really fine measurements to be able to pull these signals out from the noise. Another kind of secondary emission or a secondary effect is the lensing of the CMB. So again, the picture is the CMB photons are coming from 13.7 billion years ago, I guess 13.4 billion years ago. And as those photons are traveling towards us, they interact with the stuff in the universe and they are lensed. Now, the lensing picture that we like to use, which I love, is the same image of if you take a candle flame, you can all do this tonight, you can take a wine glass. If you hold it up to the wine glass, you'll see this. In this case, it's an Einstein ring. Now, the CMB photons are not experiencing such strong lensing. It's a much, much weaker effect. But the same kind of deflections are happening. So the path of the CMB photon is deflected, and not very many as well. But this very subtle change we can use to learn something about the mass of the stuff, the integrated mass of the stuff doing the lensing. A picture, and an artist illustrated this one. You can see these distortions that we see on the map today help us to learn something about all the intervening structure along the line of sight. And so these are some of the secondaries that we'll look at when we think of the results that we are expecting from the Simons Observatory once we all get going and get observing. Now, Adam told you a little bit about the telescope and the design and the instrument. And until I started my PhD, I was mainly working on theory, and I had this really amazing awakening into the complexities of analysis with a real telescope. And I'm going to show you something. It's going to be very scary, but bear with me because we can push through this. So we can ask ourselves, well, what affects our measurement? Imagine I live in a universe and I only care about the microwave light coming from the cosmic microwave background. So really only that first Big Bang CMB. Well, what might get in the way of me making that measurement? Okay, so the photon leaves me at the surface of blast scattering. And the first thing it does, so these images here, you have the squares are the temperature, the E mode polarization, and the B mode polarization. So we split the polarization signal into E and B modes. And we're going to just see what might affect the light that we get. First thing we do is we're going to be lensed. So what you'll notice right away is that there's a very large B mode signal induced by the lensing. So this is not an inflationary signal. It's just coming from the lensing of the E modes by the gravitational structure. Similarly, if you focus on the temperature block, it just wobbles a little bit. It's quite subtle, but the effect is sort of coherent across the sky. Then we're going to encounter other sources of emission. Now, this is also quite subtle, but if you look on the temperature block, you'll see there are tiny dots that weren't there before. Those dots are exactly the hot and cold spots that I mentioned to you from these SZ clusters. So in fact, all of the cold spots are from clusters of galaxies. Because at this frequency, all the clusters would look colder than the CMB. And the red dots that you saw are from radio galaxies. So radio sources that are just giving off microwave emission, millimeter sources, infrared galaxies, dusty galaxies that are just giving off radiation. And so those appear as little point sources that we have to find and study. And then if you want to do only analysis of the CMB, we would remove that as well. Then we have to encounter our own galaxy, which is going to give us some Faraday rotation. And then we encounter our own clouds in the atmosphere. So now first of all, you can see why some people build telescopes to go into space, because you wouldn't have this. If you're on the ground, you have to learn how to get rid of this. But don't worry, because your telescope systematics are also going to give you some polarization effects, for example, if you don't calibrate the polarization of your own instruments. And then there's some optics, so maybe you have some interesting telescope optics, and then you've got some noise. So obviously this is made to seem very, very bad, but we do a lot of work and spend a lot of computational hours trying to disentangle these effects and to understand how to balance the telescope design with the constraints that we're getting from the telescope on cosmology. Okay, so we need big collaborations. You saw a different picture of the collaboration in 2023. This is one in 2022 in San Diego, and it's a real privilege to work with scientists from all over the world, including Canada, but and Europe and Japan, South America, obviously, to really try and work through this. So the Simons Observatory is in one of the highest and driest places to do science in the world. So 5,600 meters above sea level is the plateau, Cherotoko, on which the telescopes are located. And the reason why this is a good site, I'm sure Adam discussed with you last time as well, is that it's first of all, very high up. So we're getting less of that atmospheric contribution. The thinner the air, the less distortion it can add to our microwave photons. And it's high up, so there's less air, but it's also dry. So we definitely don't want any water vapor in the air, because that is also going to mess up your results. And so we want to have as high and dry a place as possible. It's so high, in fact, that if you're working at the telescope site, you need to take oxygen. I've never been to the site myself, but it's very difficult to do tasks like mathematics. And if you're operating a big telescope, you want to make sure you do that very well. But lots of our observations are done remotely and from living rooms in Toronto. Okay, so we have two kinds of telescopes that we're building for the Simons Observatory, and they do two different kinds of goals. If you think back to the image that I showed you of the data from different telescopes, typically there's a large angle or small k or small l part of the spectrum, and a small scale or large L part of the spectrum. And those are telling us more about the astrophysics of stars, galaxies, dark energy, neutrinos, versus studying inflation. And so depending on what you want to do, you either want to build a very big telescope that can have a fine resolution, so that's what we call the large aperture telescope, or you have a small aperture telescope that measures a small patch of the sky, but with a lower resolution, but to incredible depth. And that will help you pull out this very, very faint signal from inflation. And so those are the small aperture telescopes. And we are pushing hard to first light and first cosmology results coming up very soon. So this is illustrated a different way. We have the large aperture and the small aperture survey. So you can see here the parts that are not kind of grayed out is the observing region. And so for the Simons Observatory small aperture survey, this will be a small patch of sky overlapping with observations from BICEP and Keck, for example. And then the large aperture survey will be as much of the sky as we can see from Chile, about 40% of the total sky, and it will overlap with surveys like the Rubin Observatory and SCSS and DESI and the Dark Energy Survey. And that is also very useful, because then you can make CMB maps and correlate them with optical data from different telescopes to try and learn about with the physics in common with those different probes. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of power spectra, and we're going to see a lot of constraints. These spots, so the kind of benefit that we get from the Simons Observatory compared to existing experiments is in a few different ways. First of all, that lensing that I talked about, the higher your resolution of your telescope and the better your noise, the more you can reconstruct those small changes because of the lensing. You saw that it was such a subtle effect in temperature, and so we really need low noise and a lot of the sky to reconstruct what is doing that lensing. And so that will be improved. We will also have, because we get better at polarization, so the Planck satellite is something that everybody knows very well, but Planck wasn't designed to do polarization, and so the polarization measurements are quite noisy. Experiments like the South Pole Telescope and the Atacama Cosmology Telescope have improved that even further, but the Simons Observatory will take that to the next level. So our polarization measurements will be very much improved and allow us to then make these incredibly precise constraints on the power spectrum. You can see these error bars are really teeny tiny. We'll also be able to detect so many more of those clusters, right? These galaxy clusters through the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. The more we can detect, the more that tells us about how is clustering happening in the universe. Can we learn something about baryons, etc.? And so this will be a great improvement as well. So I'm going to briefly run down through our cosmological model and give some examples of places where we can change, improve, and adjust the cosmological model. And I'm also going to highlight some work by some of my students to show what kind of projects we work on when you are working on a big experiment like the Simons Observatory. So our cosmological model is very simple and beautiful. It has 6 parameters in it. And the cosmological model includes densities. It includes constraints on the power spectrum, the primordial power spectrum of fluctuations, and tau, or the reionization of the universe. And so we're going to discuss that in a little bit of detail. So the densities, they just come from the Einstein field equations, right? They tell us the densities of the universe change how the universe behaves. And Adam ran you through this previously. The sort of the pie chart that we would have, which breaks all the total density of stuff in the universe into the various components. If it is greater than 1, we have a closed universe. If it is less than 1, we have an open or saddle universe. And it's flat in 3D space if we have the densities totaling 1. Now, the way we can actually measure that is very cool. It's by looking at how the blobs or the hot and cold spots actually change depending on the cosmological parameters. So as an example here, this is made by a grad student within the Simons Observatory. If you take, this is a standard cosmology with all the parameters that were released by the Planck satellite. If we then add more matter to the universe, the actual sky looks very, very different. The amplitude, so the brightness and the cool, hot and cold spots get hotter and colder. And that's because the amplitude then changes. So we can actually sort of tell apart even visually. And typically the way we tell this apart is through this the power spectrum, which is the summary statistic. We can learn about the flatness of the CMB in a very similar way. If all of the total components didn't add up to 1, you would actually find that the hotspots themselves got bigger. So this previous example, the sizes of the spots are roughly the same, but the amplitudes are changing. In this example here, I'm making the sum of all the components either be less than or greater than 1. And what you actually see is that the spots themselves get bigger and smaller. So that tells us something about what we call the curvature of the universe. It's sort of like saying if I have the CMB spots roughly as being a standard ruler, then the apparent size of that ruler changes depending on what's in the universe. And the boomerang experiment was the first to really constrain, to show us that the universe is flat, or the densities are largely consistent with 1. I like this plot. This is a schematic plot from Wen Hu and others, which basically says if we have those CLs that you've seen so many times, the wiggles, which parts of the CL are telling us about which parts of cosmology. Now, it's a little bit technical here, but it shows us that if I care about say, the curvature of the universe, then I'm going to actually see that the spectrum shifts left or right as the spots get either bigger or smaller. If I care about, say, the dark matter density, then the peaks are going to go up and down, and the amplitudes are going to increase. So that's a nice, I actually have this printed out on my whiteboard in my office to remind me if I ever forget, like this is the map of all of these fluctuations. Okay, I mentioned that we make these map fluctuations for polarization. And so we've got Stokes parameters, the Q and U, and we map them onto this curl-free and divergence-free fields. So in other words, fields that have a symmetry of rotation and fields that don't. And the key thing is that the polarization tells us a lot about the inflationary time of the universe, and it tells us a lot about the reionization of the universe. Because we have these electrons in reionization, and they're scattering off photons, which will actually change the power spectrum on the very largest scales. So when you hear people talking about tau, what they're meaning is the optical depth at reionization. So how did the reionization of the universe proceed? And we'll talk a little bit towards the end of the talk about how we can modify and try to understand our model of inflation. Sometimes we assume the universe just went from totally opaque to totally ionized, but really we know that probably it proceeds through bubbles in the slowly getting ionized in the universe. Okay, so here's that pie chart that tells us what the universe is made up of in terms of all of its components. So the first thing that we have is that, you know, on the right-hand side, the colorful pie chart, that's telling us of all the baryons or the ordinary matter in the universe, what is it made up of? And we've got gas, we've got warm and cold gas, we've got stars, we've got galaxy clusters. And all of this pie chart together on the right-hand side is equal to the tiny little sliver on the left-hand diagram. So that's the ordinary matter, about 5% of the total. The rest of the pie is made up of dark matter at around 25% and dark energy at around 70%. And we can constrain a little bit about that using these observations of the CMB. So I already showed you in the previous diagram where the spots got sort of the amplitude got brighter. That's one way we can control we can measure the cold dark matter. So when people say, oh, the only evidence we have for dark matter is the rotation curves of galaxies, actually you can tell them, no, the hot spots and cold spots of the CMB would be very different amplitudes if we had different amounts of cold dark matter. And so we have very strong limits on the amount of dark matter in the universe just from the CMB, from nothing else at all. Okay, so now in this basic cosmological model, I'm going to tell you about the other things we can constrain. So on the right-hand side here, you see we have two parameters, which we call the amplitude of the spectral, the amplitude of scalar fluctuations, and the scalar spectral index, or NS. Now, the reason why these two things exist is because we want to come up with a description of how many blobs of a certain size do I expect from my earliest model of inflation, right? So if I look around at the room I'm in, I see a few chairs. So there are lots of objects of chair size. I see a couple of humans. So there's some human-sized blobs, and then I see some books. So if I was to take the power spectrum of objects in my house, there would be a lot of power on the scale of a human, on the size of a human, and there'd be a lot of power on the size of a book, for example. There wouldn't be power on the size of a car. I don't have anything in my room that's the size of a car. And we can play the same game in the universe. We can say, you know, roughly on what scale are galaxies or stars or clumps of matter, in this case, just fluctuations in the density, what is the distribution? And you know, as good physicists, the first thing we assume is let's assume it's a power law, and we have an amplitude and then an index that tells us what the power law is. That's all that is. The scalar spectral index is that amplitude, and is the index, and then AS is the amplitude. Okay. And what happens is, as we change the amplitude, the power spectrum goes up and down. As we change the scalar spectral index, we change the balance between big and small blobs in the universe. Now, we can actually measure that scalar spectral index with our CMB measurements, because anything that's changing the underlying fluctuations is also going to change the fluctuations in the CMB, because the hot and cold spots in the CMB are generated by the overdensities and underdensities in the universe from the early power spectrum. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. So in our primary cosmological model, we come up with these parameters. So this is from a recent paper by Act a couple of years ago. And it seems silly, as some of my colleagues who do in other fields, they say, oh, you cosmologists, you're always just talking about error bars on numbers. But the key thing here is that these 6 numbers are actually telling us kind of everything we need to know about the cosmology of the universe. And so the name of the game is, can I make those measurement errors as small as possible? And also, can I understand differences or discrepancies in the values between different groups? And so you see sometimes there are some interesting results when you get different values, say for H naught or for something else between different experiments. Okay, so there's a lot more we can unplug here. And there is, so with some of my colleagues, we actually made a series of notebooks, which are you can find on GitHub, that actually can take you through some examples of simulating the CMB sky in lots of different ways. First of all, with primordial cosmology changes, but then also doing things like changing the noise of the experiment and the beam. And if you ever want to play around, it's a really fun way, maybe to do over the break, if you want to get more of a handle in analysis techniques. And I'll share the link as well with folks later. Okay, so what can we do if we want to understand the baryons in the universe, for example, and how baryons interact with galaxies? We can combine maps of the CMB with maps of galaxies from other surveys, like the Dark Energy Survey. And this was work that one of my students, who's recently become a postdoc, Martine Loken, did, where she combined density maps from the Dark Energy Survey and maps of this SZ, the thermal SZ from ACT, and stack them together to reveal the kind of signal that we're getting as gas flows into a galaxy cluster. I mentioned that there's this hot gas that is changing the temperature of the photons, but you can actually measure the inflow of the gas into this cluster and its orientation, which is really cool. And this is why you want to overlap with optical surveys, for example. So how can we change our model? I gave you those 6 parameters, but how can we iterate a little bit? Well, the first thing we can do, and one thing that I work on, is what if we say, let's mess with our model of dark matter a little bit. So instead of just saying we have cold dark matter that we don't really know what it is, let's introduce a different kind of dark matter model. Okay, so right, dark matter in a nutshell, we don't see it because it doesn't reflect or emit light in the same way that baryonic matter, like this mirror, does, right? Similarly, this giraffe is reflecting the light of the sky, whereas if I looked at it in infrared light, it's also emitting its own light. If it was made of dark matter, it would do neither of those things. But we can measure it through its lensing signal as an example. And so this is, the Abel cluster that you all know, but of course we know we get it in the CMB as well. We get gravitational lensing. And so because we want to understand more than just dark matter exists, we want to understand potentially what it is, we can come up with different models and see how they change those observables that I talked about in the beginning, how they change our power spectrum. One of these models is called an axion, which is an ultralight scalar field. Now, maybe you haven't heard the word ultralight scalar field in one sentence before. So we're going to do a super quick recap of what this is. So scalar field sounds scary. People talk about the Higgs boson, but you can think of another example of a scalar field, which is maybe a bit more at home to you, which is the temperature on Earth. So it's a scalar because it has one number, just temperature, and no direction. And in this case, it's a field because we're describing it in its 3D position on the Earth. Now imagine you have a scalar field. It's an axion, which has some 3D information, 3D position all over the universe. The key thing in cosmology is the dynamics of the scalar field, how it's changing with time, is set by what we call a potential. And in this case, the scalar field potential is like the bottom of a wine bottle. And this tells us how the axion is going to behave as a function of time in cosmology. So originally, these particles were come from particle physics. These idea of these axions comes from particle physics, but we can map how they affect our observables in cosmology through how the axion is changing with time through this potential and how it's interacting with all the other stuff in the universe. So let us go here. Oh, and I should say, what do we mean by ultralight? I think it's useful for context. So when things get really light, we stop talking about them in terms of kilograms. We talk about them in electron volts. And that's because we can convert, E equals mc squared. We can convert mass to energy easily. And so an electron volt is a unit of mass. And so 1 electron volt is roughly 10 to the minus 36 kilograms. The axions that we care about, so a proton weighs about a billion EVs, and the axions we care about weigh 10 to the minus 22 EVs. So much lighter. So that's why we say ultralight. The neutrino, for example, we're sort of talking about a tenth of an EV. The reason why you should care about it is because depending on the mass that we assume for the axion, they can actually behave a little bit like dark matter or a little bit like dark energy. And some of the work that I do with folks in my group is trying to understand what that means for these maps, these observables, this lensing of the CMB, because it'll have a big impact on our understanding of what the cosmological components are. So work by a postdoc and a student, Alex Laku and Keir Rogers, has basically shown us that we need to do some modeling of the axion and its the way it clumps and clusters. The key thing about axions is they don't cluster like normal dark matter, and so they tend to wash out some of the structure in the universe. So if you think about this in the power spectrum, imagine if I chopped up all my books. That would mean that on the book scale, I have less power than I thought. I'm washing out that structure, and axions kind of do that. So at the scale of galaxies, they wash out some of the structure, they remove some of the structure, they prevent the galaxies from clustering in that way. And so we'd expect limits, depending on how much clustering we see, we can put limits on how much of the universe is made up of these axions. And with the Simons Observatory, because we're able to measure very small scales and the lensing of the CMB, we actually will be able to rule out or detect, even if only 2% of the universe is made up of these axions, we will be able to find it with the Simons Observatory, which is pretty amazing. Because right now, we just have limits. We just say there can't be more than a certain fraction, depending on what mass we assume of the axions. Okay, I can skip past that. With another of my students, we can start to play a game to say, depending on this potential that we described, how the axions behave, can we understand a little bit more about if the model that we have for axions is natural, if it's finely tuned, if it makes sense? Because you don't want to say, well, okay, dark matter is difficult to understand. We don't know what it is. Let me come up with a new model for dark matter, but I'm going to make it super finely tuned and very specific so that essentially it's as difficult to explain as dark matter. And Harrison Winch is understanding and figuring out how we can use our observations to tell us about how special this model is that we happen to have chosen for axionic dark matter. Because as a physicist, I want my model to be as unassuming as possible. I don't want it to be finely tuned or very specific. Okay. We can also mess with the universe in the sense of neutrinos, right? Neutrinos essentially are coming because there are these relativistic particles in the early universe that look like extra radiation, and then at late universe, they look more like pumping like normal matter. So depending on the amount of neutrinos in the universe, we would expect galaxy clustering and suppression to change. And experiments like the Simons Observatory and CMB Stage 4, which is the next telescope to be built after that, will also change, will also improve our constraints on n effective. Roughly the extra radiation you might expect away from a standard model. A standard model with 3 neutrinos gives us a certain amount of this extra radiation or this radiation at early times, and we're looking for changes to that relative to our standard model. And what you'll see, and this is a bit of an old diagram now, but what you'll see is that any changes to this kind of physics adding extra radiation or changing the neutrinos. It's all mainly changing the large L or the small scale part of the spectrum, which is why building these big telescopes is really important so that we can measure the impacts on this small scales. So this diagram that you see here is a fun two-dimensional view of when we were designing the observing strategy for the Simons Observatory, how we picked the right kind of survey. Because as you change the resolution, which is linked to the telescope design, you can also change the noise of your telescope, right? How sensitive is it? What is the noise of the maps that you'll make? And it's sort of competing because you want to be able to have a fine resolution and a low noise. And you can see here, the better you do at changing those values, the more precisely you can constrain this ineffective parameter as a cosmological component. Because the smaller the error bars we can make on the power spectrum at very small scales, the more sensitive we are to small changes in a theory model around that baseline cosmology. Let's see. Okay, I don't want to go on too much longer since I know we want to have questions. So let me go on. Go on to this final point here. With apologies to skipping Victor's work, but I'll link to the slides. My student Victor did some great work that just went on the archive. So another thing that you might have heard of is the tensor to scalar ratio. So what does that mean? The primordial cosmology model I gave you was just in the baseline scalar fluctuations, the primordial scalar perturbations. However, we know in some models of inflation, you actually, at the very early times when inflation is happening, you're essentially getting perturbations in space-time itself. So those fluctuations from that rapid inflationary period are not scalar fluctuations, they are tensor fluctuations, because they're actually fluctuations in the space-time metric. And so then you need to expand your model a little bit. You now have your scalar fluctuations and you have tensor fluctuations. And we describe the ratio of those. So what is the fraction of tensor fluctuations relative to the amount of scalar fluctuations? And we call that the scalar to tensor ratio. So the amplitude of the tensors divided by the amplitude of the scalars. And we call that R. And in order to measure that, the best place to do it is on the very large scales, because remember, that's where we're going to see the biggest picture from in our inflationary model on the very largest scales. You see here, these theory models, you have a couple have shown, one is R of 0.1, one is R of 0.01. There was a big excitement a few years ago when there was hints of a value of R of 0.2. Now those have been revised a little bit. And one of the goals is to put a constraint on those values of R, because that will tell us something about our cosmological model. And this is something I'm working on with some students, one of whom is Danielle Danin, who's just started. And then in terms of other constraints on inflation, we can also relax that assumption of just an amplitude and a scalar spectral index, which is work that Simran Nerval is working on as well. Basically saying, instead of just having a power law, which is my model that I just imposed, can I actually measure what the fluctuations are in bands or bins as a function of K? And that also tells us something interesting, because some inflationary models would have a big spike of fluctuations at a certain scale. And so we want to constrain exactly what the amplitudes of those fluctuations are. Okay, so finally, I hinted at this in the beginning, but we talked about this value tau and how the universe reionized, but we can actually change that a little bit and say, can we model more clearly how reionization happened? Because we think it's going to happen in bubbles, so they're like big sources that are reionizing the universe, that progresses over time. Can we actually model that and measure the impact on the CMB fluctuations? So these are previous constraints from other groups and some forecasts. But working with my student Margaret Ikape, we're actually asking, can we use the fluctuations in the CMB to tell us something about how the universe went from being opaque after the H1 is everywhere, and we know that reionization then started around redshift, between redshift 5 and 10. And so how do we see how that proceeds? This is really important if you think about experiments like JWST, because we need to know how the universe reionized at early times so that we can also match late time observations like the galaxies that we see at later times with JWST. It's still very early times, but yeah. Okay, so I did a huge rush through all of our cosmology. You can see here a sort of summary of some of our error bars and some of the data that we actually use. So it's always really surprising to me how we use a lot of statistical methods to really get as much as we can out of just measurements of the microwave sky as a function of frequency. But the nice thing about that is that we can cut the data up and look at it 100 ways and come up with constraints on so many possible extensions and models. The world is really our oyster, and we can think of new ways that the universe might be, components it might have, and how it evolves, and then match that or fit that to the data to try and learn a little bit more about the universe we live in. Thank you so much for your time, and I can take some questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Renee. That's very interesting talk, and I'll open the floor. Does anybody have a question? You can just unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
It definitely was a lot all in one go, so I appreciate everyone might be like, whoa.
Oh, okay. There's a long one from Jess about the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect lensing and all secondary anisotropies. It still warps my mind that the photons from the CMB are affected by galaxy clusters in the foreground. At the time of the last scattering surface, those galaxy clusters hadn't been formed yet, and the CMB mass is what would eventually go on to form those clusters. Is it just me, or does everyone take a long time to find this intuitive?
So it's not just you. A lot of it's difficult that a lot of what we see is a projection, right? One of the reasons why CMB astronomy can sometimes seem more confusing is because when we measure redshifts of galaxies, it sort of clearly separates them out in redshift space. But in the CMB, everything is kind of projected, and so it can be confusing. But while the densities in the early universe are the same things that eventually form galaxies and impact the hot and cold spots of the CMB primordially, we know that those CMB photons, once they leave, right, it's sort of like we're looking at a photo of you holding a picture of your baby photo, right? So in the sense, yes, the light has been traveling from the CMB, and so that the galaxy cluster, that light is interacting with it, and so we're seeing the impact of something at lower redshift on the impact on the CMB photons from higher redshift. So you're right, it's confusing, but we're seeing two different types of physics happening at the same time. And I should say, the photon that has been kicked up in energy by the cluster, you're only seeing that photon once. You're not seeing that photon as it was in the past and in the present. It's just that we see that, the whole projection. So we're seeing lots of photons that haven't touched any galaxy clusters, and those are the background. And then we're seeing some that are interacting with the galaxy cluster. But we don't see that, we don't see the same photon having two things done to it. If that makes sense. I think I made it more confusing. Sorry, Jeff.
No, just as that helped. The photo I'm holding on my baby was taken in longer wavelength light than the photo of myself. Oh,
great. Yeah.
that's the baby. Yes. But yeah,
it is also comforting to know that every time we look, we really are looking in the past. And so, yeah.
But yeah, I second Jess. Yeah, it's not intuitive. It takes a while to just sit down and then ruminate on what is happening.
One of my favorite anecdotes about the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. So Zeldovich was the PhD advisor, and Sunyaev was the grad student who came up with these. And Zeldovich is no longer alive, but Sunyaev is, and I've met him, and he tells a wonderful story about when he was working on this as a graduate student. His PhD advisor told him, "Don't worry about a factor of pi. If you get the calculations wrong, it's such a small effect, no one will ever be able to measure it. So it's fine if you make a mistake." And so when we contacted him and said, "We've discovered this thing that you predicted in your PhD," he really started to cry. He was very emotional because he never thought this thing that he worked on would ever be detectable by a telescope. So it's really quite cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Any other question from the room? I have one. If you can go back to one of your slides with when you mentioned about the 2% fluctuations, that graph that Simon Observatory can detect even.
Of the axions, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about the error bar on that? Because yes, that's the one I was thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is a forecast that we did. So I'm glad we got time to go back to this because I know this was a lot all in one go. So if I want to make a prediction for what the telescope will see, it's really hard to know. I haven't detected axions, right? So I need to sort of guess what is an allowed value. So I'm trying to do a forecast. And in fact, I'm doing a Fisher matrix forecast, which is basically saying, if I assume some true cosmology, will I be able to, what will the error bars be on that cosmology? Like, if I assume I run the marathon, how fast will my time be? Now that's hilarious because I could never run a marathon, but and so in this case, we don't have any evidence yet for axions. So I just assumed, imagine the whole universe had 2% axions. In this case, I'm assuming the axion is in a lot of different masses. So the ones on the left, the very, very light 10 to the minus 32 EV axions, those are the ones that look a lot like dark energy in the universe today. And the slightly heavier ones, 10 to the minus 22 EV axions, those are the ones that look more like dark matter. In each case, I've just assumed that there was 2% of the total. So 98% of the dark matter is normal dark matter and 2% is this axion dark matter. And then I'm saying, will the Simons Observatory be able to detect that? And so what you see here is the sort of orangey, light orange band. That's our current constraint from Planck. And we really can't tell the sort of anything different from zero, not statistically. But what you notice is that if there is 2% of the universe made of axions in 10 to the minus 28, right now we can't tell. It's consistent with zero, but we will definitely be able to detect that with the Simons Observatory. Or conversely, we can say the other plot that I sort of skipped over, this plot says, what is the lowest fraction that we will be able to exclude? So the universe can't have more than such amount of its total dark matter made of axions. Now, this sounds silly. You may say, well, 2% is like zero. Why do we care? But the key thing is, if we find out that the universe has a fraction of axions, that radically changes our understanding of what dark matter could be. Because right now, we know that dark matter doesn't really clump. Is just clumping, but we don't know what the dark matter, is it a particle? What is the mass of the particle? We don't really have a good theoretical description for what it could be. So that's very unsatisfying to us. And so in this case, we want to say, well, is there a model that I can rule out or detect? Because that will dramatically change our theoretical understanding of what dark matter is. And in the end, that's one of my main goals.
I see. Yes, yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. That clears up the. Yeah, there's another one from Jess. It looks like the Simon Observatory will be able to answer many, many questions over its lifetime. once SO sees first light and starts doing science, what do you think will be the first question you try to answer? If you could
Ooh,
predict
fun.
what, if you could predict the first press release from results from the SO, what do you think it'll be about? That's a very
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we're proceeding, we're working on all parts. And in fact, the folks working on the telescopes and the detectors are all working, and the people working on analysis are getting our pipelines ready. But we think that the first data we take will probably be with the small aperture telescopes, those ones that look for inflationary signals. And there we have a target of where we'd like to be in terms of sensitivity to the 10 to the scalar ratio R by by our first results. So my hope is that we will detect gravitational waves with a certain value of R, or we will be able to say we don't see R at a certain limit. That's slightly less fun, but either I would be happy with either of those. When it comes to the large aperture telescope, the interesting thing about that is, I told you we make these maps of the sky and then we get our science. What's interesting is that a lot of our time is spent doing the analysis to make sure that the maps are ready. Like, do we see some weird stuff? Does it, what is the scanning like? How do we get that? And so all our results actually often come all together. So I think we'll put tight constraints on the value of the Hubble parameter independently of Planck. And I imagine on other parameters like the neutrino mass, I think that will be a really exciting result for us. But really, I'm excited for all of the results to come from ESA.
Yes, so exciting. Yeah, I would imagine like the moment you have the data from the first light, it'll be like all archive data, or all archive paper, it'll be from Simon observatories, just like what the JWST did,
Yeah,
the Erosita
exactly.
ones. Yeah, we're
It's
waiting.
it's so exciting. And I think it can be very tricky because unlike a place where you go get data from a telescope and then you just release it, but so
Mhm.
much of our work is done in the background. And sometimes I know students can be really sad and frustrated because they work so long, but then there's like this huge flood, which is great.
Yep. That's amazing. Any other questions? All right. If not, thanks, Renée, again. Thank you for coming to us and then explain all this. This is very exciting. We cannot wait
Such
to
a
see.
pleasure.
Yeah, we cannot wait to see the results from the Simon's Observatory, and then fingers crossed for the first light 2024. I hope there's nothing delay it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and then see you. Have a good weekend, or not yet weekend, but yay.
Thanks so much.